Sometimes life hits you so hard, you'll take help from anywhere, even from family you never knew. Reuben Carter was broke, desperate, and running out of ways to provide for his young son, Micah, when he inherited something unexpected: an abandoned prison. His great-uncle, a former warden, left him the crumbling facility before dying. With nowhere else to go, Reuben brought Micah to live there while figuring out their next move. That's when Micah found the crack in the courtyard floor. Below lay a hidden vault filled with stolen treasure worth $75 million, gold, art, and documents from a decades-old conspiracy. But they weren't the only ones who knew about it. Someone was willing to kill to keep the secret buried. What if the real treasure could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Reuben Carter had been staring at his kitchen table, covered with overdue bills and a foreclosure notice that might as well have been his death sentence. The divorce papers lay beneath the stack, final and unforgiving. Sarah had taken everything that mattered, the house, most of their savings, and worst of all, she'd tried to take Micah. Thank God the judge had seen through her new boyfriend's money and her lawyer's manipulations. Shared custody, they'd called it. But Reuben knew what it really meant. He had his son every other week, and during those precious days, he had to pretend that sleeping in his car between jobs was just a temporary adventure. Micah never complained. That was the thing that broke Reuben's heart most. His 12-year-old son's quiet acceptance of their circumstances. The boy would fold his long legs into the back seat of their aging Honda Civic, his dark hair falling across eyes that seemed far too understanding for someone who should still believe the world was fair. "Dad, you know I don't mind," Micah had said just last week, adjusting the pillow they'd bought at a thrift store. "We're like explorers, right? Like Lewis and Clark." Lewis and Clark. Reuben had smiled despite everything. His son had inherited his love of history, but also something more valuable, an ability to find hope in the darkest places. It was a trait that Reuben feared he'd lost somewhere between losing his job at the auto plant and watching his marriage crumble. The call from the lawyer had come on a Tuesday morning, while Reuben was filling out his 15th job application of the week. William Carter, a great-uncle he'd met maybe twice in his childhood, had died at 91 and left Reuben something unexpected: a property in upstate New York. "It's unusual," the lawyer had said over the phone, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could be either wonderful or terrible. "The property includes what was once Millbrook State Penitentiary. It's been abandoned since 1952, but your great-uncle maintained ownership through some rather complex legal arrangements. A prison. Of all things, he'd inherited a prison. But when you're down to your last $100 and facing the prospect of telling your son you might have to surrender custody because you can't provide a home, even a crumbling prison starts to look like salvation. The drive to Millbrook took them through small towns that seemed frozen in time, past farms where corn stubble poked through early snow and old barns leaned against the weight of decades. Micah pressed his face to the passenger window, his breath fogging the glass as he tried to catch glimpses of their destination through the bare trees. "Tell me again what you remember about Great-Uncle William," Micah said, his voice carrying that particular tone children use when they want to hear a story they've already heard. Reuben adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, thinking back to childhood family gatherings where William Carter had been a quiet presence in the corner. Always polite, but somehow separate from the rest of the family. "He was your great-great-uncle, technically. My grandfather's brother. He worked at the prison most of his life, was the warden there for over a decade before it closed." "Why did it close?" "I'm not sure. Budget cuts, maybe. Or maybe they just didn't need it anymore." Reuben glanced at his son. "We'll find out together, won't we?" Millbrook State Penitentiary revealed itself gradually, like something emerging from a half-remembered nightmare. First came the outer fence, topped with rusted coils of barbed wire that had lost their menace to time and weather. Then the guard. Towers. Empty windows staring blindly across grounds where weeds had grown tall enough to hide whatever secrets lay beneath. The main gate stood open, its heavy iron bars frozen in place by decades of rust and neglect. A faded sign, barely legible through years of weather and vandalism, proclaimed Millbrook State Penitentiary, established 1923, closed 1952. Wow, Micah whispered, and Reuben couldn't tell if it was wonder or apprehension in his son's voice. The prison complex sprawled across 15 acres, a collection of red brick buildings connected by covered walkways that had once channeled the movement of guards and inmates. The main cell block rose 3 stories, its windows boarded with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bone. Smaller buildings clustered around it like children seeking protection from a stern parent. The administration building, the workshop, the laundry, and what appeared to be living quarters for the staff. Reuben parked near what the lawyer had identified as the administration building. According to the documents, this was where William Carter had maintained an apartment during his tenure as warden, and where he'd continued to live even after the prison closed. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," Micah said, climbing out of the car and shouldering his backpack. Everything the boy owned in the world fit into that pack, and a single duffel bag in the trunk. "Your great-great-uncle spent most of his life here," Reuben replied, pulling their meager belongings from the car. "I imagine it became home after a while." The administration building's front door stood beneath a concrete archway carved with the state seal. The lock turned easily with the key the lawyer had provided, as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the smell hit them immediately, not the mustiness Reuben had expected, but something cleaner, as if someone had been maintaining the place. The entrance hall stretched before them, its terrazzo floors still gleaming despite decades of abandonment. Official portraits lined the walls, governors and wardens and commissioners, their formal poses and stern expressions speaking of an era when authority wore a different face. At the far end of the hall, a wide staircase led to the upper floors, where the warden's apartment waited. "Dad, look at this!" Micah called from beside a glass display case that had somehow survived intact. Inside, yellowed photographs showed the prison in its operational prime. Guards marching inmates across the courtyard, workshops where men bent over industrial sewing machines, a surprisingly well-appointed library where inmates sat reading at long wooden tables. "They tried to rehabilitate people here," Reuben observed, studying a photograph of what appeared to be a graduation ceremony. "That's something, I suppose." They climbed the stairs to the second floor, where a hallway lined with office doors led to the warden's private quarters at the far end. The apartment that had been William Carter's home for the last 70 years of his life was a revelation. Not the sparse, institutional space Reuben had imagined, but rooms filled with comfortable furniture, walls lined with books, and windows that offered a commanding view of the entire prison complex. "He never left," Reuben murmured, setting down his suitcase in what had clearly been William's bedroom. The bed was made with military precision, and on the nightstand sat a photograph of a young woman in a 1940s dress. A letter beside the photograph was addressed to "My dearest Margaret" in William's careful handwriting, but never sent. Micah had discovered the kitchen, where canned goods lined the pantry shelves, and a note on the refrigerator, written in William's hand, read, "For Reuben and the boy, welcome home. Everything you need is here. Look carefully, and you'll understand why I waited for you." "Dad, what do you think he meant by that?" Micah asked, holding up the note. Before Reuben could answer, they heard voices outside. Through the window, they could see a small group of people gathered near their car. An elderly woman with silver hair, a middle-aged man in a hardware store jacket, and a younger woman holding the hand of a small child. "The welcoming committee," Reuben said with a wry smile. "Come on, let's go meet the neighbors." The elderly woman introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, a lifelong resident of Millbrook who remembered when the prison was still operational. "William was a good man," she said, her voice carrying the careful assessment of someone who had watched their community change over decades. Kept to himself mostly, but he was always fair. The townfolk respected him. The man in the hardware store jacket was Tom Bradley, owner of Bradley's Hardware and Feed, the kind of establishment that served as the unofficial information hub for small communities. "Strange business inheriting this place," he said, not unkindly, but with the directness of someone who believed in speaking plainly. Most folks figured the state would eventually tear it down. The younger woman, who introduced herself as Lisa Myers, seemed more curious than concerned. "Are you planning to live here permanently?" she asked. It's quite a place to call home." Reuben found himself explaining their circumstances with more honesty than he'd intended. Something about these people's straightforward manner made pretense seem pointless. Yes, they were starting over. Yes, it was temporary until he could figure out their next steps. No, he didn't know much about his great-uncle's life or why he'd inherited the place. "William used to say this place had unfinished business," Mrs. Hoffman said, as the group prepared to leave. "Never knew what he meant by that, but he said it more than once. Maybe you'll figure it out." After the visitors left, Reuben and Micah spent the afternoon exploring their new temporary home. The apartment was fully furnished and, surprisingly, equipped with modern amenities, electricity, running water, even internet service that William had apparently maintained until his death. That evening, as they sat in William's living room eating canned soup and crackers, Micah pulled a leather-bound journal from one of the bookshelves. "Dad, look at this. It's got Great-Uncle William's name in it." The journal's pages were filled with William Carter's methodical handwriting, entries dating from 1943 to just months before his death. Most seemed routine, administrative notes about prison operations, personnel issues, maintenance concerns. But scattered throughout were entries that seemed different, more personal and cryptic. March 15th, 1945. "The last of the special prisoners arrived today. God help us all for what we're being asked to do." September 3rd, 1947. Found another loose. "Stone in the courtyard. The ground here holds too many secrets. Someone should know the truth before it's too late." December 12th, 1951. "They're closing us down, but they don't understand what that means. The evidence must be preserved. Margaret would have known what to do." January 8th, 2023. "Reuben Carter seems like a good man from what I can observe. Strong moral character, devoted to his son. If he's the one who finds this, perhaps there's still hope for justice." Reuben looked up to find Micah watching him with those two perceptive eyes. "Dad, what do you think he meant by special prisoners? And why does he mention your name in an entry from this year?" Before Reuben could answer, a sound from outside made them both freeze, the scrape of metal on stone, as if someone was walking carefully across the courtyard below. Reuben moved to the window and peered through the darkness, but saw nothing, except shadows cast by the security lights that still functioned throughout the complex. "Probably just an animal," he said. But he made a mental note to check the locks before they went to bed. That night, lying in William Carter's spare bedroom, while Micah slept peacefully in what had been the warden's study, Reuben stared at the ceiling and wondered what they'd gotten themselves into. The journal entries suggested that William had spent decades guarding some kind of secret, and his final entry indicated that Reuben's arrival hadn't been as random as it seemed. Outside, the wind rattled the windows of their stone fortress, and, somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, a sound that might have comforted the prisoners who'd once dreamed of freedom beyond these walls. Tomorrow, Reuben decided, they'd explore the grounds more thoroughly. If William Carter had left them this place for a reason, if there really was unfinished business, as Mrs. Hoffman had said, then maybe it was time to discover what his great-uncle had been protecting all these years. After all, they had nothing left to lose, and perhaps everything to gain. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with frost covering the prison courtyard like a shroud. Reuben had to drive into town to handle paperwork with the county clerk's office. Something about transferring utilities and property taxes that couldn't wait. He'd been reluctant to leave Micah alone, but the boy had pleaded to stay and explore. While the morning light made the place feel less ominous. "I'll stick to the main buildings," Micah had promised, shouldering his backpack with the determination of a young explorer. "And I'll keep my phone on." The courtyard stretched nearly 200 feet square, bordered by the main cell block on the north side and smaller administrative buildings on the other three sides. What drew Micah's attention wasn't the imposing architecture, but the ground itself. Unlike the concrete walkways that connected the buildings, the courtyard floor was made of fitted stone blocks, many of which had shifted and cracked over the decades of freeze and thaw cycles. One crack in particular caught his eye, a jagged line running between two massive stones near the center of the courtyard. It was wider than the others, wide enough that when Micah knelt down and peered into it, he couldn't see the bottom. More intriguingly, a faint current of air seemed to be flowing up from the opening, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else he couldn't identify. Micah pulled a small LED flashlight from his backpack, a habit he'd developed during their months of uncertainty when they never knew where they'd be sleeping. The beam penetrated only a few feet into the crack before being swallowed by darkness, but it was enough to reveal that the opening continued downward, possibly much deeper than he'd expected. Testing the stability of the stones around the crack, Micah found that one of the massive blocks had shifted enough to create a gap just wide enough for someone his size to squeeze through. His father would probably call this dangerous and irresponsible. His father wasn't here. The descent was more controlled than Micah had expected. Below the courtyard level, the crack opened into what appeared to be a natural cave system that had been partially excavated and reinforced with concrete. Someone had installed metal rungs in the wall, creating a ladder that led down into the darkness. The rungs were old but solid, and they showed signs of regular use despite the prison's long abandonment. 15 feet down, Micah's flashlight beam found the floor of a tunnel that stretched away from the courtyard in two directions. The walls were lined with the same brick used in the prison's construction, and overhead, a series of electric lights hung from conduits that had been installed decades ago. When Micah tried the switch he found near the ladder, he was amazed to discover that the lights still worked. The tunnel system was extensive, clearly the result of years of careful planning and construction. To the left, the passage sloped gently downward and seemed to head toward the outer perimeter of the prison complex. To the right, it curved back toward the main cell block. Micah chose the left passage, following it as it descended deeper underground. After walking for several minutes, the tunnel opened into a large chamber that took Micah's breath away. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that had been carved from the natural rock and reinforced with concrete arches. But what made Micah's heart race wasn't the impressive construction, it was what the chamber contained. Wooden crates were stacked along the walls, dozens of them in various sizes. Some were open, revealing contents that gleamed dully in the electric light. Gold bars, silver ingots, jewelry, and objects that looked like religious artifacts. Other crates contained what appeared to be paintings wrapped in oiled cloth, their frames visible beneath protective coverings that had kept them safe from moisture for decades. In the center of the chamber, a metal table held papers and documents protected by glass cases. Micah approached carefully, his flashlight beam revealing typed pages in multiple languages, official-looking stamps and seals, and photographs that made his stomach turn. Images of people in striped uniforms, of buildings with smokestacks, of scenes he recognized from history books about World War II. One document immediately caught his attention, a manila folder marked Millbrook Transfers Classified in red stamp letters. Inside, Micah found a multi-page list typed on official letterhead, 1943, Prisoner Transfer Manifest, Special Security. Protocol. The manifest contained names, dates, and brief descriptions. Most were German names followed by SS ranks and notations like War Crimes Tribunal Priority 1 or Intelligence Value Extreme. What made Micah's hands shake as he held the document was a pattern he noticed in the transfer records. Prisoners were listed as transferred to Millbrook with arrival dates, but the departure information was either blank or marked with cryptic. Notations, processed final, medical transfer terminal, or simply disposed. Heinrich Weber, SS Oberführer, arrived March 15, 1945. Processed final Klaus Richter, SS Sturmbannführer, arrived April 2, 1945. Medical transfer, terminal doctor. Friedrich Mengele, SS Hauptsturmführer, arrived June 8, 1945. Disposed. The list went on for 3 pages, containing the names of over 60 individuals. None of them showed any record of being transferred out of Millbrook alive. Micah photographed every page with his phone, his hands trembling as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a prison. It had been some kind of secret facility where high-ranking Nazi officers and war criminals had been brought after the war. And according to these records, none of them had ever left. The sound of footsteps echoing from the tunnel made Micah freeze. Someone else was down here, moving through the passages with the confidence of familiarity. He quickly returned the manifest to its folder and switched off his flashlight, relying on the overhead lights to navigate back toward the entrance tunnel. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by voices, 2 men speaking in low, urgent tones. Micah pressed himself against the wall of the tunnel, trying to make out their conversation. "Told you this place should have been sealed decades ago," one voice was saying. "Now we've got civilians living here, and that kid's been asking questions. In town. William Carter was supposed to handle this before he died," the second voice replied. "The old bastard lived here for 70 years and never said a word. Now his great-nephew inherits the place and we've got problems. What do you want to do about it?" "Same thing we should have done when Carter first started getting sentimental. Sometimes the cleanest solution is the most permanent one." Micah felt his blood turn to ice. These men were talking about his father and him, and their words carried an unmistakable threat. He waited until their voices faded back toward the outer passages, then climbed the ladder as quickly as he dared. Emerging into the courtyard, Micah carefully repositioned the stone block to conceal the entrance, though he doubted it would fool anyone who knew what to look for. His phone showed 17 missed calls from his father, and the most recent text message was marked urgent. "Coming home now. Something's wrong. Don't talk to anyone." 20 minutes later, Reuben's car pulled through the prison gates with the urgency of someone fleeing danger. He found Micah sitting on the front steps of the administration building, the transfer manifest. New printouts folded in his jacket pocket. "Dad, what happened in town?" Micah asked, noting the tension in his father's expression. "The clerk acted strange when I mentioned William Carter's name," Reuben said, climbing the steps to sit beside his son. "Asked a lot of questions about how long we were planning to stay, whether we'd found anything interesting in William's belongings. Then I saw the same black sedan that was parked outside the hardware store yesterday." Micah pulled the printed pages from his pocket. "Dad, I found something big." As Reuben read through the prisoner transfer manifest, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a grim understanding that matched the gravity in his son's voice. "These names," Reuben said slowly, "some of these are people I recognize from documentaries about war crimes trials. But according to this, they never made it to trial. They came here instead," Micah said, "and they never left. Dad, I think Great-Uncle William was running some kind of secret execution facility, or he was ordered to," Reuben replied, his voice heavy with the weight of inherited responsibility. "Either way, we're now sitting on evidence of something that powerful people have kept hidden for 80 years. They sat in silence for a moment, father and son both understanding that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated. The black sedan Reuben had noticed wasn't a coincidence, and the men Micah had overheard in the tunnels weren't casual trespassers. "What do we do?" Micah asked. Reuben folded the papers carefully and looked out across the prison courtyard where so many secrets lay buried. "We figure out the truth," he said finally. "Your great-great-uncle spent his whole life guarding whatever's down there. If he left this place to us, maybe he expected us to finish what he couldn't. And if those men come back, then we make sure we know more about what's really buried here than they think we do." Reuben stood and extended his hand to help Micah up. "Come on, son. Time to see what else your great-great-uncle left for us to find." As they headed back into the administration building, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree, lying beyond the prison's outer fence, or the telephoto lens that had been documenting their conversation from a distance that rendered them as clear as if they were standing arm's length away. That night, armed with flashlights and a camping lantern, from William's surprisingly well-stocked storage room, Reuben and Micah returned to the underground chamber. The electric lights still worked, but Reuben wanted backup illumination if anyone decided to cut the power while they were below ground. The chamber looked even more overwhelming in the steadier light. What Micah had initially taken for dozens of crates were actually closer to 100, stacked and organized with military precision along the curved walls. Each crate bore markings in different languages: German, Italian, French, and many had shipping labels that traced their origins. Across wartime Europe, "We need to be systematic about this," Reuben said, pulling on the work gloves they'd found in William's apartment. "Document everything, photograph it, but don't disturb the organization. Someone went to a lot of trouble to catalog all this." They started with the smallest crates, which proved to contain jewelry, coins, and personal items that clearly hadn't belonged to any American prisoners. Reuben found himself handling wedding rings, family photographs, and religious artifacts that told stories of lives interrupted by war. Each piece felt like holding someone's stolen history. Micah had moved to a different section, where larger crates contained paintings wrapped in oiled cloth. As he carefully lifted the protective covering from one canvas, his breath caught. "Dad, this looks like something you'd see in a museum." The painting showed a young woman in traditional Jewish dress, her eyes holding a mixture of sadness and defiance. The signature in the corner read, "A. Weiss, 1936, and attached to the frame was a small metal plate with German text that Micah couldn't read. "It's beautiful," Reuben said, joining his son, "and probably worth more than we could imagine. But the real question is, where did it come from, and how did it end up here?" Their answer came from an unexpected source. In the center of the chamber, beneath the table holding the prisoner manifest, Micah discovered a metal strongbox that had been concealed by hanging cloth. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, they found what appeared to be a personal journal written in German, along with an English translation in William Carter's careful handwriting. The journal belonged to SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Weber, and according to William's translation, it contained Weber's confession, written during his final days at Millbrook in 1945. "My name is Heinrich Weber," the confession began, "and I am going to die for my crimes. This is as it should be. But before I face judgment, I must tell someone where I hid what I stole, so that it might someday be returned to those it was taken from." Weber's confession revealed a systematic operation that had stripped Jewish families, museums, and private collectors across occupied Europe of their most valuable possessions. Art, gold, religious artifacts, and family heirlooms had been collected under the guise of safeguarding cultural treasures from the war, then shipped to secure locations for distribution among high-ranking Nazi officials. "We told ourselves we were preserving these things," Weber wrote, "but we were thieves, nothing more. When the war began to turn against us, those of us who could see the end coming started making private arrangements. I diverted 3 railroad cars worth of stolen goods to a contact in New York, thinking I could buy my way to freedom in America." The confession went on to detail how Weber had been captured by American forces in 1945 and brought to Millbrook under false pretenses. He'd been told he would be held temporarily before being transferred to stand trial, but Weber quickly realized the truth: he was never intended to leave the prison alive. "Warden Carter is not a cruel man," Weber wrote, "but he follows his orders. I have been told that my execution is scheduled for tomorrow and that the official record will show that I died attempting to escape. Perhaps that is better than the truth that the American government has decided some secrets are too dangerous for public consumption." Weber's final entries revealed the location of his hidden cache. In the chamber beneath the courtyard, behind the false wall in the eastern alcove, you will find what I stole. I have made a list of everything, with descriptions of where each piece came from when I could remember. Let it be known that Heinrich Weber died, knowing he was a thief and a murderer, but hoping that someday someone with more courage than I possessed would return what was stolen to its rightful owners. "Dad," Micah said quietly, "look at the date of his last entry, March 20th, 1945, 5 days after Weber's arrival at Millbrook, according to the transfer manifest, and the same date listed as processed final." Reuben set down the confession and looked around the chamber with new understanding. "William didn't just guard this place," he said slowly. "He was part of whatever operation brought these war criminals here. But somewhere along the way, he must have started having second thoughts. They found Weber's false wall in the eastern alcove, exactly where the confession indicated. Behind a panel of concrete that had been cleverly disguised to look like the rest of the chamber's construction, they discovered Weber's personal cache, smaller items of exceptional value that he'd apparently hidden separately from the main collection. Among Weber's hidden treasures were 3 paintings that made Micah gasp in recognition. He'd seen similar works in his history textbook section on Holocaust art, paintings by Jewish artists whose work had been systematically destroyed or stolen by the Nazis. These 3 canvases, signed B. Weiss, S. Weiss, and M. Weiss, appeared to be works by 3 different members of the same family, the Weiss family, Reuben said, remembering the name from the first painting they'd found. Weber's confession mentions them specifically. An entire family of artists whose studio was raided in 1943. Attached to the back of each painting was a photograph showing the works hanging in what appeared to be a comfortable middle-class home, with family members posed proudly beside them. The photographs were labeled in German, but William's translations were clipped to each one. The Weiss Family Collection, Berlin, 1942. As they carefully returned Weber's confession to its protective wrapping, Reuben found himself thinking about the moral complexities of their situation. These weren't just valuable artifacts. They were stolen pieces of people's lives, things that had been torn from families who were almost certainly murdered for the crime of existing. "What do we do with all this?" Micah asked, echoing his father's thoughts. "We figure out who it belongs to," Reuben replied. "And we find a way to get it back to them, if any of them are still alive." They were preparing to leave the chamber when they heard it again, the sound of footsteps in the outer tunnel, this time accompanied by the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. Reuben quickly extinguished their lantern and motioned for Micah to move behind one of the larger crates. Through the chamber's entrance, they could see 2 figures approaching with the purposeful movement of people who knew exactly where they were going. "Told you the entrance was compromised," one voice was saying. "That kid found it yesterday, and now they're both down here playing amateur archaeologist. Orders are to let them dig for now," the second voice replied. "Let them find what they're going to find, document what they can, then we clean up the whole mess. The Foundation wants to know exactly what Carter left behind before we dispose of it." "And the family?" "Accidents happen. Father and son exploring. An old prison, tragic structural collapse in the tunnels. These old places are dangerous." Reuben felt Micah tense beside him, and he placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. They waited in silence until the footsteps retreated back toward the entrance tunnel, then gave it another 10 minutes before moving. "Who's the foundation?" Micah whispered as they climbed the ladder back to the courtyard. "I don't know," Reuben replied, "but I think we're about to find out." Back in William's apartment, as they spread Weber's confession pages across the kitchen table, a folded note fell from between the journal's pages, something William had left but they'd missed in their initial examination. In William's careful handwriting, "If you're reading this, then you've found Heinrich Weber's confession. This is only the beginning." Weber was just one of 63 war criminals who died at Millbrook between 1945 and 1951. What you found represents stolen property from hundreds of families across Europe. But more importantly, it represents proof of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of the American government, a conspiracy that is still active today. Trust no one in authority until you understand how deep this goes. W.C. Looking out at the prison courtyard where moonlight cast long shadows between the buildings, Reuben realized that inheriting this place hadn't just given them a home. It had made them guardians of evidence that could rewrite history books and destroy powerful people who thought their secrets had died with William Carter. The question now was whether they would live long enough to see justice done. The next morning brought another discovery that made Weber's stolen treasures seem almost innocent by comparison. While exploring a different section of the underground complex, Micah found a passage that led to what appeared to be a medical facility, complete with examination tables, surgical equipment, and filing cabinets filled with documents that made Reuben's blood run cold. The files were meticulously organized, labeled by year and patient number rather than names. But the contents revealed horrors that went far beyond simple executions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, according to her credentials displayed on the office wall, had been conducting medical experiments on the war criminal prisoners between 1945 and 1951. Subject 23A, read one typical report dated September 1947, continued testing of psychological conditioning techniques. Subject shows increased compliance after third week of sensory deprivation combined with pharmaceutical intervention. Recommend escalation to Phase 3 protocols. The clinical language barely concealed the reality of what had been happening in the underground medical facility. Prisoners who were supposed to be executed quickly had instead been kept alive for years, subjected to experimental procedures that tested everything from truth serums to mind control techniques. "Dad," Micah said, his voice shaking as he read through another file, "this isn't just about stolen art. They were using these people as laboratory rats." Dr. Mitchell's final report, dated December 1951, was addressed to someone identified only as Director, Special Projects Division. The report summarized 6 years of experiments and recommended that all subjects be terminated and all records transferred to secure facilities as discussed. The Millbrook program has achieved its objectives and should be dissolved to avoid potential exposure. What made the discovery even more disturbing was a list of names attached to Mitchell's final report. Not the prisoners who had been experimented on, but the American officials who had authorized and funded the program. The list read like a who's who of post-war American politics and business, including senators, cabinet members, and executives from major pharmaceutical companies. Reuben recognized several names from his son's history books, men who had gone on to distinguished careers in public service. According to Mitchell's records, they had not only known about the experiments but had requested specific research into techniques that could be useful for interrogating captured enemy agents during the Cold War. "These aren't just war criminals we're talking about," Reuben said, studying the authorization documents. "These are American officials who turned a prison into a secret laboratory. And some of these people, their children and grandchildren, are probably still in positions of power today." The medical files also contained correspondence between Dr. Mitchell and various government agencies, revealing that the Millbrook experiments were part of a larger program spanning multiple facilities across the United States. The program, codenamed Operation Mindbridge, had been designed to develop psychological warfare techniques that could give America an advantage in the emerging Cold War. In one particularly chilling letter, Mitchell wrote, "The German subjects have proven invaluable for testing procedures that would be impossible to conduct on American prisoners. Their wartime crimes make them ideal candidates for experimental protocols, and their eventual disposal eliminates any concerns about long-term psychological damage or legal complications." Micah had been quiet for several minutes, reading through a file that seemed to disturb him more than the others. Finally, he looked up at his father with tears in his eyes. "Dad, this file is about a kid. Subject 31B was only 16 years old. He wasn't a war criminal. He was just a German soldier who got captured at the end of the war. They kept him here for 3 years, testing drugs on him, trying to see if they could make him forget his own identity." The boy's file contained photographs that showed his progressive deterioration over the 3 years he'd been held at Millbrook. In the first photo, taken upon his arrival in 1948, he looked like any teenager, scared but defiant. The final photo, taken shortly before his death in 1951, showed a hollow-eyed shell of a person who barely seemed human anymore. Reuben felt something break inside him as he looked at those photographs. This had stopped being about recovering stolen property or exposing historical secrets. This was about justice for people who had been tortured and murdered in the name of American national security. "We need help," he said finally. "This is bigger than we can handle on our own." That afternoon, Reuben called his old friend, Jake Morrison, a lawyer who had helped him navigate the divorce proceedings. Jake had been a criminal defense attorney for 20 years before switching to civil rights law, and if anyone would know how to handle evidence of government crimes, it would be him. "You're telling me you found documents proving the U.S. government was conducting illegal medical experiments on prisoners?" Jake's voice over the phone carried a mixture of disbelief and professional excitement. "Reuben, if even half of what you're describing is true, this is the biggest civil rights case of the century." "What do we do?" Reuben asked. "We've got people watching us, people who've made threats. I'm worried about Micah's safety." "First, you document everything. Photograph every page, every piece of evidence. Make multiple copies and store them in different locations. Then we contact the right people, journalists, human rights organizations, maybe the FBI if we can figure out who to trust." "What if the people we contact are part of this conspiracy?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "Then we go public in a way that makes it impossible to suppress. But Reuben, you need to understand what you're risking. If this evidence is real, if it proves what you think it proves, there are going to be very powerful people who want you silenced." That evening, as they continued documenting the medical files, Reuben and Micah were interrupted by a knock at the apartment door. Through the peephole, Reuben saw an elderly woman with silver hair, Martha Henley, the librarian who had been with the group of townspeople on their first day. "Mrs. Henley," Reuben said, opening the door cautiously, "this is unexpected. May I come in?" Martha asked, glancing nervously down the hallway. "There are things about your great-uncle that you need to know, and I'm afraid we may not have much time." Martha settled into William's favorite armchair and looked around the familiar room with obvious sadness. "William and I were friends for over 40 years, she said. "I was one of the few people who knew what really happened at this prison and what he'd been carrying all these years." "You knew about the underground chambers?" Micah asked. "I helped him organize the evidence," Martha replied. "After the program ended in 1951, William was ordered to destroy everything. All the medical records, all the stolen property, all evidence that Operation Mindbridge had ever existed. Instead, he hid it all and spent the rest of his life documenting what had really happened here." Martha pulled a manila envelope from her purse. "These are copies of correspondence between William and various government officials over the years. He tried multiple times to expose what had happened, but every time he got close, someone would remind him of his oath of secrecy and the consequences of violating it." The letters in Martha's envelope showed a man tortured by his conscience, trying to find a way to reveal the truth without destroying his own life. In a 1967 letter to a senator, William wrote, "The American people deserve to know what was done in their name at facilities like Millbrook. These were not legitimate military operations. They were crimes against humanity that violated every principle our country claims to stand for." The senator's response was brief and threatening. "Mr. Carter, you are reminded that your continued silence is a condition of your freedom. Any attempt to discuss classified operations will result in your immediate arrest and prosecution for treason." So he spent 50 years collecting evidence and waiting for the right moment to act, Martha said. "When he learned about your situation, your divorce, your financial troubles, your strong moral character, he decided you might be the person who could finish what he couldn't." "Why us?" Reuben asked. "Why not go to journalists or human rights groups himself?" "Because William was still bound by his secrecy oath and because he was being watched." "But you're not bound by any oath, and you inherited the property legally. What you do with what you find is your choice, not his." Martha stood to leave, but paused at the door. "There's something else you should know. The people who have been watching you, they call themselves the Foundation, but they're really just the descendants of the men who authorized Operation Mindbridge. They've spent decades making sure this secret stays buried, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose it." After Martha left, Reuben and Micah sat in William's living room, surrounded by the evidence of decades of carefully concealed crimes. Outside, the prison courtyard lay quiet under the starlight, but they both knew they were being watched. "Dad," Micah said quietly, "are we going to be able to stop them?" Reuben looked at his son, this brave, intelligent boy who had accidentally uncovered one of the darkest secrets in American history, and felt a resolve he hadn't experienced since before his life had fallen apart. "Yes," he said, "we're going to stop them. We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened here, and we're going to see that justice is finally done. Even if it's dangerous?" "Especially because it's dangerous," Reuben replied. "Some things are more important than being safe." The breakthrough came when Micah, using his natural aptitude for internet research, managed to trace the Weiss family paintings to their original owners. Working late into the night, while Reuben documented the medical files, the boy had used the photographs attached to each painting to search Holocaust survivor databases and art recovery websites. "Dad, I found them," Micah announced, his voice tight with emotion. "The Weiss family. Some of them survived." On his laptop screen was a website for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, featuring a section on recovered artworks. The page showed the same 3 paintings they had found in Weber's cache, along with a heartbreaking description of their history. The Weiss family had been prominent artists in Berlin before the war. Benjamin Weiss, the father, had run a successful gallery that featured works by Jewish artists whose careers were destroyed when the Nazis came to power. His wife, Sarah, and son, Michael, were also accomplished painters whose works had been displayed in galleries across Europe. In 1943, the Say family had been arrested during a raid on their studio. According to witness testimony collected after the war, SS officers had spent hours cataloguing every painting, sculpture, and piece of art in their possession before loading everything onto trucks. The family had been deported to Auschwitz, where Benjamin and Sarah had died in the gas chambers within weeks of their arrival, but Michael Weiss had survived. "He's still alive, Dad," Micah said, scrolling down to a more recent photograph showing an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Dr. Michael Weiss, age 96, living in New York City. He's been searching for his family's stolen artwork for over 70 years. The The website included contact information for Dr. Weiss, along with a note that he worked with various organizations to recover and repatriate stolen Nazi art. There was also a phone number for his granddaughter, Dr. Rebecca Weiss Goldman, who apparently managed his correspondence. Reuben stared at the computer screen, thinking about the 3 paintings hidden in the underground chamber. These weren't just valuable artifacts. They were pieces of a man's murdered family, works created by parents and himself that had been stolen on the night his world ended. "We have to call them," he said. The conversation with Dr. Rebecca Weiss Goldman was one of the most emotionally difficult phone calls Reuben had ever made. How do you tell someone that you found artwork stolen from their family during the Holocaust, hidden in a secret chamber beneath an abandoned prison? "My grandfather never stopped looking," Rebecca said, her voice breaking when Reuben described the paintings. "He spent his entire life trying to recover pieces of his parents' work, but most of it was lost or destroyed. To find 3 paintings that they created together, it's like recovering pieces of his soul." Rebecca explained that her grandfather had become a prominent psychiatrist after the war, specializing in treating Holocaust survivors and their families. He had used his professional success to fund art recovery efforts and had helped dozens of families reclaim stolen property over the decades. "He's going to want to meet you," Rebecca said, "both of you, when he learns that you're trying to return the paintings instead of sell them. Well, it's going to restore some of his faith in humanity." But there was a complication. When Rebecca asked about the circumstances of the discovery, Reuben found himself explaining about the prison, the secret chambers, and the evidence of government involvement in hiding stolen Nazi property. "You need to be very careful," Rebecca warned. "My grandfather has dealt with art recovery cases involving government agencies before. There are powerful interests that would prefer this kind of evidence never see the light of day. Have you considered contacting the FBI or other law enforcement?" "We're not sure who we can trust," Reuben admitted. "The people watching us seem to have connections in government." "Then you need to go public in a way that makes it impossible to suppress," Rebecca said, echoing Jake Morrison's earlier advice. "Media attention, international pressure. Once the story is out there, it becomes much harder for anyone to silence you." That afternoon, while Reuben worked on photographing more of the medical files, Micah made another discovery that changed their understanding of the situation's scope. Hidden behind a loose brick in the medical facility's wall, he found a metal box containing correspondence between Dr. Mitchell and executives from major pharmaceutical companies. The letters revealed that Operation Mindbridge hadn't been just a government program. It had been a public-private partnership involving some of America's largest corporations. Companies that were still in business today had provided funding and technical expertise for the medical experiments, with the understanding that they would have access to any useful research results. "Look at this," Micah said, showing his father a letter dated 1948. Hartwell Pharmaceuticals provided $50,000 in research funding and requested regular reports on psychological conditioning techniques with commercial applications. Reuben recognized the Hartwell name. Their products were sold in every pharmacy in America, and the company's executives were frequently quoted in business magazines as pillars of the community. The idea that the company had been built partly on research, derived from Nazi-style medical experiments, was almost impossible to process. Another letter from Morrison Chemical Corp was even more explicit. "We are particularly interested in any compounds developed through your behavioral modification research that might have applications in industrial psychology or employee motivation programs." They were trying to figure out how to control workers' minds, Micah said with disgust. They were using what they learned from torturing prisoners to make employees more compliant. The corporate connection explained something that had been puzzling Reuben, how the foundation could have the resources and connections to monitor them so effectively. If descendants of these corporate executives were involved, they would have access to private security firms, government contacts, and financial resources that could easily overwhelm two people living in an abandoned prison. That evening, Jake Morrison called with disturbing news. "I've been doing some research into the names you gave me from Dr. Mitchell's files," he said. "3 of the companies are still major players in the pharmaceutical industry, and 2 of the government officials mentioned have sons currently serving in Congress." "What does that mean for us?" Reuben asked. "It means we're not just dealing with historical crimes, we're dealing with people who are still alive and still powerful. If this evidence becomes public, it won't just damage reputations. It could destroy careers, collapse stock prices, and potentially lead to criminal charges." Jake paused before continuing. "Reuben, I think you and Micah need to consider leaving the prison and going somewhere safe while we figure out how to handle this properly." "No," Reuben said firmly. "We're not running. William Carter spent 70 years protecting this evidence, and he trusted us to see it through. Besides, if we leave now, they'll just destroy everything and claim it never existed. Then we need to move fast. I'm going to contact some journalists I trust, people who specialize in investigative reporting. We need to get this story out before Jake's." The sentence was cut off by the sound of his office phone being disconnected. Reuben tried calling back, but Jake's office number went straight to voicemail. His cell phone rang once and went dead. Looking out the window of William's apartment, Reuben could see the black sedan parked at the prison's main entrance, its occupants no longer bothering to hide their surveillance. In the distance, he spotted and 2 more vehicles positioned at different points around the perimeter. "Dad?" Micah asked, noting his father's tense expression. "I think we're running out of time," Reuben said. "They're not just watching us anymore. They're surrounding us." As if in response to his words, the apartment's phone began ringing. When Reuben answered, an unfamiliar voice delivered a simple message. "Mr. Carter, you and your son need to pack your belongings and leave the premises immediately. For your own safety, of course. You have 1 hour." The line went dead, leaving father and son alone in William Carter's apartment, surrounded by evidence of decades-old crimes and faced with a choice that would determine not just their own fate, but whether justice would ever be served for the victims of Operation Mindbridge. "What do we do?" Micah asked. Reuben looked at his son, this brave boy who had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American society, and made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. "We make sure the world knows the truth," he said, "even if it kills us." Instead of packing their belongings, Reuben and Micah spent their final hour making the most important discovery yet. In the section of the underground complex they hadn't fully explored, behind what appeared to be a maintenance door, they found William Carter's true secret, a complete archive of classified documents that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The files were labeled Operation Safekeep and bore the highest levels of government classification. According to the documents, Millbrook hadn't been an isolated facility. It was part of a network of 12 former prisons and military installations across the United States, where stolen Nazi property had been deliberately hidden to avoid international scrutiny and political embarrassment. "Look at this," Micah said. His voice hushed as he read from a 1946 memo marked "Eyes Only, Presidential Authorization." They knew that returning the stolen property to its rightful owners would create diplomatic problems with allies who had their own secret arrangements with captured Nazi officials. The Operation Safekeep files painted a picture of systematic deception at the highest levels of government. Rather than dealing with the moral and political complexities of repatriating stolen property, American officials had decided to hide it indefinitely, hoping that time would eventually make the problem disappear. A memo from the Secretary of State in 1947 was brutally honest about the motivations. The American public must never learn that we have been warehousing stolen property while Holocaust survivors struggle to rebuild their lives. The political consequences would be catastrophic, particularly given our current efforts to position America as the moral leader of the free world. But the most damning document was a complete list of all 12 facilities, their locations and inventories of what they contained. Millbrook held stolen art and gold, but other facilities contained everything from religious artifacts to entire libraries that had been confiscated from Jewish communities across Europe. The list also included current status reports on each facility. Most had been decommissioned over the years, a euphemism that appeared to mean the contents had been quietly sold off to private collectors or destroyed to eliminate evidence. Millbrook was one of only 3 facilities that still contained its original cache, and William Carter had been designated as the caretaker responsible for preventing exposure. "Dad, this is huge," Micah said, photographing page after page of classified documents. "This isn't just about one prison or one conspiracy. They've been systematically hiding stolen Holocaust property for over 70 years. Among the operation, safekeep files were personnel records that revealed the true identities of everyone involved in the program. The names read like a who's who of post-war American power brokers, politicians, business leaders, military officials, and intelligence operatives who had built their careers partly on the foundation of concealed war crimes. More disturbing were the successor files, documents showing how knowledge of the program had been passed down through family lines and business relationships. Children and grandchildren of original conspirators had been briefed on the secret and given responsibility for maintaining the cover-up across generations. The foundation that had been watching them wasn't just a group of concerned descendants. It was an organized conspiracy that had been actively protecting the secret for decades, using murder, intimidation, and corruption to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. A 1987 report detailed the termination of a journalist who had been investigating unusual property transfers from closed military facilities. A 1999 memo described the accidental death of a former prison guard who had begun talking to Holocaust researchers about unusual activities he'd witnessed in the 1940s. "They've been killing people for decades," Reuben said, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. "Anyone who got close to exposing this secret." The sound of vehicles approaching made them both freeze. Through the basement window, they could see multiple black SUVs pulling through the prison gates, their headlights cutting through the evening darkness like search beams. "Time's up," Micah said, stuffing the most important documents into his backpack. But as they prepared to flee deeper into the tunnel system, they heard something unexpected, the sound of different vehicles approaching from another direction, accompanied by shouted orders and what sounded like law enforcement radio chatter. Looking out from a different window, they saw FBI tactical vehicles surrounding the black SUVs, agents in body armor taking positions behind their vehicles, and demanding that the Foundation operatives step out with their hands visible. "This is Agent Patricia Vance, FBI," a woman's voice echoed across the courtyard through a megaphone. "You are surrounded and have no legal authority to be on this property. Exit your vehicles immediately and surrender your weapons." Agent Vance. The name appeared multiple times in William Carter's personal files, correspondence dating back decades between William and an FBI agent who had been investigating Operation Safekeep independently, building her own case against the conspiracy. "William wasn't as alone as we thought," Reuben said with relief and admiration. Through the chaos outside, they heard the apartment door upstairs being kicked in, followed by the sound of multiple people searching the rooms above. But instead of the Foundation operatives they'd been expecting, the voices they heard carried the professional tone of law enforcement officers. "Mr. Carter, Micah, this is Agent Patricia Vance with the FBI. We're here to help you." Emerging from The basement, Reuben and Micah found themselves face to face with a woman in her 60s, whose grey hair and lined face couldn't conceal the determination in her eyes. Agent Vance was flanked by 2 other agents, all of them wearing body armor and carrying weapons. "Agent Vance," Reuben said, "we found your correspondence with William, and we found a lot more than that," Patricia replied grimly. "William Carter spent 40 years feeding me information about Operation Safekeep, building a case that could finally bring down this conspiracy. When he learned he was dying, he told me he'd found the perfect people to finish what we started." "The Foundation people outside," Micah began, "are under arrest," Patricia said. "We've been tracking their activities for months, waiting for them to make a move that would give us probable cause. Threatening American citizens and trespassing on federal property was exactly what we needed." Patricia explained that William's death had triggered a carefully planned operation. His will had contained specific instructions for Patricia to monitor the prison and intervene if Reuben and Micah were threatened. The evidence they'd been discovering wasn't just random. William had organized it specifically to be found, documented, and used to build an unassailable legal case. "But there's a problem," Patricia continued. "The Foundation has allies in very high places, politicians, judges, corporate executives. Even with all the evidence you've found, they're going to try to claim national security privilege and have everything classified and sealed." "So what do we do?" Reuben asked. "We make it impossible for them to suppress," Patricia replied. "We go public in a coordinated way that ensures the story gets out before they can stop it. Media, international organizations, Holocaust remembrance, groups, everyone at once." Martha Henley appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 more FBI agents. "I'm sorry for the deception," she said to Reuben and Micah, "but I've been Agent Vance's informant for over 20 years. William needed someone local who could watch over you and report back." The pieces were falling into place. William Carter's elaborate plan to expose the truth, executed through people he'd spent decades recruiting and positioning. Reuben and Micah hadn't stumbled into this conspiracy by accident. They'd been carefully chosen to be the ones who would finally bring justice to the victims of Operation Safekeep. "There's something else," Patricia said, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "The other 2 facilities that still contain original caches, we raided them simultaneously tonight. We now have evidence from all 3 locations, along with complete documentation of the conspiracy." Outside, the last of the Foundation operatives were being loaded into FBI vehicles, their decades-long reign of terror finally coming to an end. "What happens now?" Micah asked. Patricia smiled, the first genuine smile they'd seen from anyone in days. "Now we make sure the whole world knows what happened here, and we make sure that every piece of stolen property goes back to its rightful owners, even if it takes years. Even the powerful people involved, especially the powerful people involved," Patricia replied. "Justice doesn't have a statute of limitations when it comes to crimes against humanity." As FBI agents began the careful process of cataloging and removing evidence from the underground chambers, Reuben looked out across the prison courtyard, where so many secrets had been buried for so long. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility that the victims of Operation Mindbridge and Operation Safekeep would finally receive the justice they'd been denied for over 70 years. The next morning, as FBI agents continued their methodical documentation of the underground chambers, Agent Patricia Vance led Reuben and Micah to a section of William Carter's apartment they hadn't fully explored, a small office behind the bedroom that had been sealed with a combination lock. "William gave me the combination in his final letter," Patricia explained, her fingers working the lock mechanism. "He said this room contained his most important legacy, something that would change how you understood everything that happened here." Inside the office, they found something that took their breath away. a complete video recording studio with professional cameras, editing equipment, and shelves lined with carefully labeled VHS tapes and DVDs dating back decades. Reuben Carter hadn't just been collecting evidence, he'd been creating a comprehensive audio-visual record of Operation Safekeep and Operation Mindbridge. He recorded everything, Patricia said, pulling a tape labeled Final Testament for Reuben and Micah Carter from a special case on the desk. Interviews with survivors, confessions from participants who developed consciences, documentation of every crime committed at this facility. As Patricia loaded the tape into a VHS player, the room filled with Reuben Carter's voice. Not the voice of a frail 91-year-old man, but the strong, clear voice of someone who had spent his life bearing witness to terrible truths. "If you're watching this," Reuben began, his image appearing on the screen, "then you've found the evidence I've spent my life protecting, and Agent Vance has decided you can be trusted with the complete truth." The video revealed a story far more complex than anything they'd imagined. Reuben Carter hadn't been a complicit warden who later developed a conscience. He'd been an undercover federal investigator from the beginning, placed at Millbrook by President Truman himself to monitor and document what was being done there. "In 1945, I was a young FBI agent who had served in Army intelligence during the war," Williams' recorded image continued. "When reports reached Washington about unauthorized activities at several prison facilities, President Truman ordered a secret investigation. I was chosen to go undercover as a prison warden and gather evidence of any wrongdoing." What William had discovered at Millbrook had horrified him, but his orders were clear. Document everything, but take no action that would compromise the investigation. For 6 years, from 1945 to 1951, he had been forced to watch as prisoners were tortured and murdered while maintaining his cover as a loyal prison administrator. "The hardest part wasn't witnessing the crimes," William said, his recorded voice heavy with decades of guilt. "It was knowing that my superiors in Washington were receiving my reports and choosing to let the operations continue. By 1948, it became clear that the investigation wasn't intended to stop the crimes. It was intended to control them." The video revealed that Operation Mindbridge and Operation Safekeep had been authorized at the highest levels of government, with the knowledge and consent of President Truman, his cabinet, and congressional leaders from both parties. What had begun as a legitimate effort to interrogate captured Nazi war criminals had evolved into something far more sinister. A systematic program to develop psychological warfare techniques that could be used against America's new enemies in the Cold War. "The prisoners who died here weren't just war criminals," William continued. "They were test subjects in experiments designed to give America an advantage in the coming conflict with the Soviet Union. The stolen property wasn't just being hidden. It was being used as funding for black operations that Congress had never authorized. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In 1951, when the official investigations were closed and the facilities were supposed to be decommissioned, William had discovered that the program wasn't ending. It was being privatized. The same people who had run Operations Mindbridge and Safekeep were forming private organizations to continue the work, William explained. They created what they called the Foundation, a shadow network of former government officials, corporate executives, and military leaders who would maintain the secret and expand the operations using private funding. The Foundation had offered William a choice: join their organization and help them transition the operations to private control, or face charges for his role in the original crimes. Instead, William had made a third choice. He'd remained at Millbrook as the official caretaker, while secretly documenting everything and building a case that could eventually bring down the entire conspiracy. "For 70 years I've been a triple agent," William said with a bitter smile. "The government thinks I'm their loyal secret keeper. The Foundation thinks I'm their obedient caretaker. But really, I've been working with a small group of federal investigators to build an unassailable case against all of them. The video showed William meeting with various people over the decades: Holocaust survivors, federal agents, journalists, and legal experts. All of them had been carefully recruited and positioned to act when the time was right. Agent Patricia Vance appeared in several of the video segments, showing how their partnership had evolved over 4 decades. Patricia was the only person in law enforcement who understood that this conspiracy reached too high to be exposed through normal channels. William explained, "We needed to build a case so comprehensive, with evidence so overwhelming, that no amount of political pressure could suppress it." The choice of Reuben Carter as William's heir hadn't been random either. The video showed William conducting what appeared to be surveillance of Reuben's life, his work history, his character references, his behavior during the divorce proceedings, and especially his relationship with Micah. "I needed someone with unshakable moral character," William said, "but also someone with no connections to government or corporate power structures that might compromise them." Reuben Carter's life demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity I was looking for: a man who would choose principle over profit, justice over safety. The video also revealed that Micah's discovery of the underground chambers hadn't been accidental. William had deliberately left clues that would appeal to a curious, intelligent child. The crack in the courtyard floor had been carefully maintained to be visible, and the ladder rungs had been recently repaired to ensure safety. "I knew that a child's natural curiosity would lead to discoveries that an adult might overlook or avoid," William explained. "And I knew that involving Micah in the discoveries would ensure that Reuben couldn't simply walk away from the moral responsibility." But the video's final revelation was the most significant. William Carter wasn't just exposing crimes from the past. He was revealing ongoing criminal activities that involved some of the most powerful people in contemporary American society. "The Foundation never stopped operating," William said gravely. "They've been running similar programs for decades, using private prisons, medical research facilities, and military contractors. The techniques developed at Millbrook have been refined and applied in interrogation programs, corporate manipulation, and political control operations." William's final recording showed documents proving that the Foundation had been involved in everything from illegal human experimentation at private medical facilities to psychological manipulation programs used by major corporations to control their workforces. The stolen Nazi gold had been invested over decades, creating a financial network worth billions of dollars that funded operations across the globe. "The evidence you found at Millbrook is just the beginning," William concluded. "It's the key that unlocks a conspiracy that reaches into every aspect of American power. The people who authorized these crimes in 1945 may be dead, but their successors are still active, still dangerous, and still committing crimes against humanity." The video ended with William looking directly into the camera, speaking to Reuben and Micah as if he were in the room with them. "You didn't ask for this responsibility, and I'm sorry to burden you with it. But you're the only people I've found who have both the moral courage to see justice done and the independence to act without being compromised. The world needs to know what happened here and what's still happening because of what happened here, Agent. Vance will guide you through what comes next, but ultimately the choice is yours. You can walk away. I've arranged for you to be financially secure, regardless of what you decide. Or you can help finish what we started and finally bring justice to the thousands of people who died for the crime of knowing too much." As the video ended, Reuben and Micah sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd learned. They weren't just dealing with historical crimes. They were confronting an active conspiracy that continued to operate at the highest levels of American society. "Now you understand why William chose you," Patricia said quietly, "and why the Foundation was so desperate to stop you. You're not just threatening to expose their past, you're threatening to destroy their future. Outside, the prison courtyard was busy with FBI activity, agents and technicians working to preserve and document evidence that could finally bring down a conspiracy that had operated in the shadows for over 7 decades. "What do you want to do?" Patricia asked. Reuben looked at his son, this remarkable boy who had started this journey by simply being curious about a crack in the stone, and knew there was really only one choice they could make. "We finish what William started," he said. "We make sure everyone knows the truth, no matter how powerful the people who want to keep it hidden. Even if it means spending the rest of our lives fighting them." "Especially if it means that," Reuben replied. "Some fights are worth a lifetime." The transformation was complete. A desperate father seeking shelter for his son had become the guardian of one of the most important truths in American history. And a curious 12-year-old boy had become the catalyst for justice that had been denied for over 70 years. The master list was William Carter's crowning achievement, a comprehensive inventory of every piece of stolen property, every victim's name, and every location where evidence was hidden across all 12 Operation Safekeep facilities. Agent Vance retrieved it from a specially constructed safe behind William's bedroom wall, its contents more valuable than all the gold and artwork combined. "This is what they've been terrified of for 70 years, Patricia explained, spreading the bound documents across William's kitchen table. Complete documentation of everything that was stolen, everyone who was murdered, and everyone who profited from the crimes. The master list wasn't just an inventory, it was a roadmap to justice. Each entry contained not only descriptions of stolen items, but also detailed provenance, showing how they had been taken, who had authorized their theft, and what had happened to the victims. More importantly, it included current locations for caches at other facilities and the names of Foundation members who had been involved in maintaining the cover-up. "Look at this," Micah said, pointing to an entry that made his hands shake. "The Goldstein Family Library from Vienna. 12,000 books, including medieval manuscripts and first-edition scientific texts. Status: transferred to Riverside. Military Academy, 1953. Current location: private collection of Senator James Morrison, Washington, D.C. Senator Morrison was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, a man whose family had built their political dynasty on what appeared to be stolen Holocaust property. His grandfather, according to the master list, had been one of the original Operation's Safekeep coordinators. "It's not just individual pieces," Reuben observed, studying another section. "They systematically looted entire communities, synagogues, schools, libraries, museums, anything of cultural or monetary value." Patricia nodded grimly. "And they've been selling pieces for decades to fund ongoing operations. The Foundation isn't just preserving their ancestors' crimes. They've been profiting from them continuously. But the master list contained something even more dangerous than evidence of historical crimes. In the section labeled Active Operations, William had documented how Foundation members had used their inherited wealth and political connections to establish modern programs that continued the original mission of Operation Mindbridge. Private military contractors conducting psychological research on prisoners at secret detention facilities. Pharmaceutical companies testing behavior modification drugs on subjects in developing countries. Corporate executives using psychological manipulation. Techniques derived from Nazi research to control their workforces. "This is why they're so desperate," Patricia said. "Exposing the historical crimes would be embarrassing and costly, but exposing their current activities would destroy them completely." The plan Patricia and William had developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Rather than trying to work through official channels where the Foundation's influence could suppress the evidence, they would coordinate a simultaneous release of information to multiple organizations worldwide. Holocaust remembrance organizations in 12 countries, Patricia explained, checking items off a carefully prepared list. Major newspapers in the United States, Europe, and Israel, international art recovery organizations, human rights groups, academic institutions with Holocaust research programs, all receiving the complete evidence package at the same time. Dr. Rebecca Weiss-Goldman had become a crucial ally in this effort. As someone with connections in both the art recovery world and academic circles, she could ensure that the story reached institutions that would be impossible for the Foundation to intimidate or corrupt. My grandfather is mobilizing every contact he's made over 70 years, Rebecca had told them during their latest phone conversation. Holocaust survivors, museum directors, human rights lawyers, everyone who has spent their lives fighting to preserve the memory of what happened. But the Foundation wasn't passive in the face of this threat. Over the past 48 hours, as news of the FBI raids leaked through law enforcement channels, they had been mobilizing resources for what appeared to be a final, desperate attempt to suppress the evidence. Martha Henley brought disturbing reports from town. "Strange men have been asking questions about you at the hardware store and the diner," she told Reuben and Micah, "offering money for information about your activities, your visitors, your phone calls. The local police chief got a call from someone claiming to be a federal prosecutor, warning him that you might be involved in selling stolen property." Jake Morrison had also resurfaced, though his experience had left him shaken. "They held me for 6 hours, he told Reuben over the phone. "No charges, no lawyers, just questions about what you'd told me and threats about what would happen if I helped you contact the media. I've been practicing law for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The Foundation's influence reached further than any of them had imagined. Judges who might hear cases related to the evidence were being contacted by concerned colleagues, warning about potential national security implications. Journalists who had been contacted by Rebecca's network were receiving calls from their editors expressing sudden concerns about the story's legal risks. "They're trying to create a wall of silence," Patricia explained. "Make everyone too scared to touch the story, even with overwhelming evidence." But William and Patricia's decades of preparation had anticipated this response. The evidence wasn't just comprehensive, it was legally bulletproof. Every document had been authenticated, every chain of custody preserved, every piece of evidence backed by multiple sources. More importantly, they had built a network of allies who were beyond the Foundation's reach. International organizations that didn't depend on American funding or political goodwill. Foreign journalists who couldn't be intimidated by threats to their careers in the United States. Academic institutions that had built their reputations on Holocaust research and education. "The beauty of William's plan," Patricia said with admiration, "is that it doesn't depend on any single institution or individual, even if they manage to silence half our allies, the other half will still get the story out." Dr. Michael Weiss himself had become the most powerful advocate for exposing the truth. At 96, with nothing left to lose and a lifetime of fighting for justice behind him, he had become the moral center of their campaign. "He's contacted every major Holocaust museum in the world," Rebecca reported. "The response has been overwhelming. These institutions have been searching for exactly this kind of comprehensive evidence for decades. They're not going to let it be suppressed now." As the day appointed for the coordinated release approached, the tension around Millbrook Prison became almost unbearable. FBI agents maintained their perimeter, but everyone knew that the Foundation had resources that could challenge even federal law enforcement if they became desperate enough. Micah had thrown himself into the final preparations with the intensity of someone who understood that this was his chance to make a real difference in the world. He'd been working with Rebecca to contact youth organizations and schools, ensuring that young people would learn about what had happened at places like Millbrook. "This isn't just about the past," he told his father. If we don't make sure people my age know about this stuff, it could happen again. The boy's maturity and moral clarity had impressed everyone involved in the operation. Agent Vance had commented that she'd rarely seen an adult with Micah's combination of intelligence and ethical commitment, let alone a 12-year-old. But it was Reuben who had surprised himself most of all. The desperate, broken man who had brought his son to an abandoned prison 3 weeks earlier had been transformed by the weight of moral responsibility into someone who could stand up to the most powerful conspiracy in American history. "You know," he told Patricia, as they reviewed the final preparations, "6 months ago I couldn't even stand up to my ex-wife's lawyer. Now I'm about to take on senators and corporate executives and people who've been getting away with murder. For 70 years, William saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself," Patricia replied. "He spent months researching your background, your character, your relationship with Micah. He knew you'd find the strength when it mattered." The final element of their plan was perhaps the most important, ensuring that Reuben and Micah would be safe once the story broke. The Foundation had shown they were willing to commit murder to protect their secrets, and exposing them wouldn't eliminate that threat immediately. "We have safe houses prepared," Patricia explained. "New identities if necessary, protection until the legal process plays out. The Foundation will be fighting for their lives once this goes public, and desperate people do desperate things." But Reuben had made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "We're not hiding," he said firmly. "We're staying right here at Millbrook in William's apartment until this is finished. He spent 70 years guarding this place. And these secrets, the least we can do is see it through to the end." "Dad," Micah said quietly, "are you sure that's safe?" "No," Reuben admitted, "but it's right. William trusted us with this responsibility, and Martha and Patricia and everyone else have risked their lives to help us. We don't run when things get dangerous." As the sun set on their final day of preparation, father and son stood together in William Carter's living room, surrounded by evidence that would soon reshape how the world understood American history and the ongoing fight against the legacy of the Holocaust. "Tomorrow everything changes," Reuben said. "Are you scared?" Micah asked. Reuben considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, he would have been terrified. Now, with the weight of moral purpose behind him and the knowledge that they were fighting for justice on behalf of thousands of victims, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. "No," he said finally, "I'm ready." Outside, the prison courtyard lay quiet under the stars, keeping its vigil over secrets that would soon be secrets no more. In less than 12 hours, the coordinated release would begin, and the Foundation's 70-year reign of terror would finally come to an end. The only question was whether Reuben and Micah Carter would live to see justice done. Dawn came grey and threatening, with low clouds that promised snow. At 6 a.m. exactly, the coordinated release began as Holocaust remembrance organizations across 12 countries simultaneously published the complete evidence package on their websites. By 6:15, major newspapers in New York, London, Berlin, and Tel Aviv had posted their first stories. By 6:30, the story was trending worldwide on social media platforms that the Foundation couldn't control. But the Foundation's response was swifter and more violent than anyone had anticipated. The first sign of trouble came when Agent Vance's secure communication line went dead at 6:45 a.m. Then the FBI perimeter around the prison began reporting interference with their radio communications. By 7 a.m., it became clear that the Foundation had resources that rivaled those of federal law enforcement. "They're jamming everything," Patricia said grimly, trying unsuccessfully to reach her backup teams. "Radio, cellular, satellite, some kind of broad-spectrum interference that's blocking all electronic communications in a 5-mile radius." From the windows of William's apartment, they could see black vehicles moving through the forest beyond the prison perimeter. Too many vehicles for the FBI teams to contain. The Foundation had brought enough firepower to overwhelm the federal agents, and they were no longer concerned about maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. "They know it's over," Reuben said, watching the movements through binoculars. "This is their last chance to destroy the evidence and eliminate the witnesses." The discovery that changed everything came when Micah, exploring William's office one final time, found a hidden compartment in the desk containing documents that even Agent Vance hadn't known existed, the Foundation's complete hit list. "Dad, look at this," Micah called, his voice tight with shock. The list contained over 200 names spanning 7 decades, journalists, researchers, government officials, Holocaust survivors, and their family members. All people who had gotten too close to the truth about Operation Safekeep and Operation Mindbridge. Next to each name was a date and a brief description: auto accident, heart attack, suicide, accidental overdose. But what made the document truly terrifying was that it was current, with entries as recent as the previous month. The Foundation hadn't stopped killing people to protect their secret. They'd simply become more sophisticated about making the murders look natural. Near the end of the list were 3 new entries that made Reuben's blood turn to ice. Reuben Carter, auto accident, pending. Micah Carter, accidental drowning, pending. Patricia Vance, heart attack, pending. "They've been planning to kill us from the beginning," Reuben said, his voice hollow. The hit list also revealed the scope of the Foundation's network. The organization wasn't just a collection of inherited guilt. It was a professional assassination and cover-up operation, with resources that rivaled those of national intelligence agencies. Corporate executives, military contractors, political leaders, and organized crime figures had all contributed to maintaining the conspiracy. At 7:30 a.m., the first explosions echoed across the prison grounds. The Foundation forces weren't just trying to capture the facility. They were planning to destroy it completely, eliminating any possibility that additional evidence might be discovered later. "The underground chambers," Patricia said urgently. "They're going to try to collapse the entire tunnel system," but Micah had already thought of that. "Dad, remember what William said in his video? He made copies of everything and stored them in multiple locations. Even if they destroy Millbrook, the evidence still exists." The boy was right, but that knowledge wouldn't save them if the Foundation succeeded in killing everyone who knew where the backup evidence was hidden. The sound of automatic weapons fire came from the perimeter as the FBI agents tried to hold their positions against overwhelming odds. Through the apartment windows, they could see muzzle flashes in the forest and the distinctive profiles of military-grade vehicles advancing on the prison. "We need to get to the tunnels," Patricia said. "It's our only chance." But as they prepared to descend into the underground complex, Micah made one more discovery that changed the entire situation. Hidden in William's desk drawer, underneath the hit list, was a device that looked like an old-fashioned radio, but was actually something much more sophisticated. "Emergency broadcast system," Patricia breathed, recognizing the device immediately. William must have installed it as a backup communication method. The device was already preset to multiple frequencies, including international emergency channels that couldn't be jammed by local interference. More importantly, it was connected to a hidden antenna system that William had apparently built into the prison's electrical infrastructure. "Can we use it to call for help?" Micah asked. "Better than that," Patricia replied, her fingers working the controls. "We can broadcast everything live. The hit list, the Foundation's attack on a federal facility, everything that's happening. Here, right now." At 7:45 a.m., as Foundation forces breached the prison's outer perimeter and began their final assault, Micah Carter's voice began broadcasting on emergency frequencies monitored by law enforcement agencies, military installations, and news organizations across the globe. "This is Micah Carter broadcasting from Millbrook State Penitentiary in New York," the 12-year-old boy said with remarkable calm as explosions echoed outside. "We are under attack by an organization called the Foundation, which has been covering up war crimes for 70 years. They have a list of over 200 people they've murdered to protect their secret, and they're planning to kill more." The boy's voice carried across radio frequencies that reached emergency responders, military bases, and news stations throughout the eastern United States. Within minutes, the story of the attack on Millbrook was being broadcast live on networks that the Foundation couldn't control or suppress. "If something happens to us," Micah continued, "the evidence of their crimes is hidden in locations throughout the country. Agent Patricia Vance has all the details. Don't let them bury the truth again." Outside, the sound of approaching helicopters mixed with the gunfire. But whether they belonged to the Foundation or to reinforcements summoned by Micah's broadcast, no one could tell. The helicopters belonged to the FBI's hostage rescue team, followed minutes later by military helicopters carrying Army Rangers who had been monitoring Micah's emergency broadcast from their base in New York. The Foundation's assault on a federal facility, broadcast live to law enforcement agencies nationwide, had triggered responses they couldn't suppress or control. But even as federal reinforcements landed in the prison courtyard, the Foundation forces made one final desperate attempt to destroy the evidence. At 8:15 a.m., explosions rocked the underground tunnel system as demolition charges detonated in carefully placed locations designed to cause maximum structural damage. "They're trying to collapse everything," Patricia shouted over the sound of falling debris and emergency sirens. "We need to get out of here now." As they fled through the tunnel system toward an emergency exit William had shown them in his video recordings, Micah made one last crucial discovery. In a reinforced chamber that had survived the initial explosions, he found a document that William had described as the most dangerous piece of evidence in the entire collection, the Foundation's original charter. The charter, signed in 1952 by 37 prominent Americans, formally established the Foundation as an organization dedicated to protecting vital American interests through the preservation of sensitive wartime secrets. But the document's true significance lay in its complete membership roster and its explicit authorization of murder as a tool for maintaining secrecy. "When circumstances require the permanent silencing of individuals who threaten organizational security," the charter read, "designated operatives are authorized to take whatever measures necessary to protect the interests of the Foundation and its members." The signature list read like a roll call of mid-20th century American power: senators, generals, Supreme Court justices, corporate executives, and intelligence officials. More damning still were the succession clauses that formally passed membership and responsibilities to designated heirs, creating the dynastic conspiracy that had operated for 7 decades. "This isn't just evidence of historical crimes," Reuben said, scanning the names as they climbed toward daylight. "This is proof that some of America's most powerful families have been running a murder organization for 70 years. Senator Morrison's grandfather wasn't just listed as a member, he was identified as the Charter's principal author and the Foundation's first operational director. The current senator hadn't just inherited stolen Holocaust property, he'd inherited leadership of an assassination network." As they emerged from the tunnel system into the chaos of the prison courtyard, they found themselves in the middle of the largest law enforcement operation in New York State history. FBI tactical teams, Army Rangers, State Police, and U.S. Marshals had surrounded the remaining Foundation forces who had taken positions in the prison's main cell block. The live broadcast of the attack had created a media frenzy that made suppression impossible. News helicopters circled overhead, and satellite trucks from major networks were setting up positions outside the prison perimeter. International news organizations were providing real-time coverage of what was being called the most significant historical revelation since the Nuremberg trials. Dr. Michael Weiss had arrived by helicopter, accompanied by directors from Holocaust museums and art recovery organizations from around the world. At 96, the elderly survivor insisted on being present when the foundation was finally brought to justice. "I waited 70 years to see this day," he told Reuben, his eyes bright with tears as he held one of his family's recovered paintings. "I never thought I'd live long enough to see justice done." The foundation's final stronghold in the cell block was surrounded, but their leaders were attempting one last negotiation. Through megaphones, they were claiming that the evidence was fabricated, that the attack had been a legitimate law enforcement operation, that national security required the suppression of the story. But their credibility had been destroyed by Micah's live broadcast and the physical evidence now being examined by international observers. The hit list alone was enough to trigger murder investigations in dozens of jurisdictions, while the charter provided legal proof of a criminal conspiracy spanning multiple generations. At 10:30 a.m., after a tense standoff that was broadcast live to audiences worldwide, the remaining Foundation operatives surrendered. Among those taken into custody were the current operational director, a corporate executive whose pharmaceutical company had been built on research derived from Operation Mindbridge experiments, and 3 sitting U.S. senators whose families had been Foundation members for decades. Senator Morrison himself was arrested at his Washington office as FBI agents served warrants based on evidence from the master list. The recovered art in his private collection, including the stolen Goldstein family library, provided physical proof of his family's participation in the conspiracy. "It's over," Patricia said, watching as the last of the Foundation prisoners were loaded into federal transport vehicles. "After 70 years, it's finally over." But even as justice was being served, the true scope of the victory was becoming clear through the international media coverage. Museums worldwide were announcing the recovery of thousands of stolen artworks. Families who had given up hope of ever seeing their ancestors' possessions were receiving calls about items identified in the master list. Most importantly, governments around the world were promising full investigations into their own possible involvement in similar cover-ups. The exposure of Operation Safekeep had triggered a global reckoning with the long-buried crimes of the post-war period. Dr. Rebecca Weiss-Goldman, standing in the prison courtyard where so much suffering had been hidden for so long, perhaps summarized the moment best. "Today, the dead finally have their voices back. Today, justice remembers their names." As FBI agents began the careful process of preserving and cataloging evidence that would fuel prosecutions and repatriations for years to come, Reuben and Micah Carter stood together in the place that had transformed them from desperate refugees into guardians of historical truth. They had finished what William Carter started, and in doing so, they had helped heal wounds that had festered in darkness for over 70 years. 6 months after the Foundation's final assault on Millbrook Prison, Reuben Carter stood in the same courtyard where his son had first discovered the crack that led to the greatest historical revelation of the 21st century. But the courtyard looked very different now. Where once there had been cracked stone and overgrown weeds, there was now a carefully maintained memorial garden with plaques, honoring every victim whose name had been recovered from William Carter's records. The crack in the stones had been preserved exactly as Micah had found it, now marked with a bronze plaque reading, "Through this opening, truth finally found the light." The Millbrook State Penitentiary had been transformed into the National Center for Historical Justice, a museum and research facility dedicated to educating future generations about the consequences of unchecked power and the importance of moral courage. The underground chambers that had once hidden stolen treasure now housed interactive exhibits that told the complete story of Operation Safekeep and Operation Mindbridge. Martha Henley had been appointed as the center's director of historical archives, her decades of secret collaboration with William Carter finally receiving public recognition. Patricia Vance had taken early retirement from the FBI to head the center's ongoing investigative programs. coordinating with law enforcement agencies worldwide to locate remaining Foundation assets and evidence. Jake Morrison had established a legal clinic at the center, providing free services to families seeking to recover stolen property or pursue justice for crimes committed by the Foundation. His work had already resulted in the return of over 3,000 stolen artworks to their rightful owners or their descendants. Dr. Michael Weiss had become the center's most cherished resident, spending several days each week sharing his experiences with school groups and researchers. Despite his advanced age, his testimony had been crucial in the prosecutions that had followed the Foundation's exposure. "The children who visit here," he often told visitors, "they're the reason we fought. So hard to reveal the truth. Every generation must learn these lessons anew, or they risk repeating the mistakes of their ancestors." The international impact of the Millbrook revelations had been profound. 12 countries had established their own truth and reconciliation commissions to investigate similar programs on their soil. The United Nations had created a special tribunal to address crimes that had been covered up through government conspiracy. More than 50,000 stolen artworks and cultural artifacts had been returned to their rightful owners or appropriate institutions. The prosecutions of Foundation members had resulted in convictions at every level of American society. Senator Morrison and 2 other senators had been sentenced to life in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Dozens of corporate executives had received lengthy sentences for their roles in funding ongoing criminal operations. The pharmaceutical companies built on research from Operation Mindbridge had paid billions in damages to victims' families. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Reuben and Micah themselves, the desperate, broken man who had brought his son to an abandoned prison seeking nothing more than shelter, had been transformed by the weight of moral responsibility into someone who commanded international respect. Universities offered him honorary degrees. Publishers wanted him to write books about his experience. Government agencies sought his consultation on historical justice issues. Reuben had declined most of these opportunities, choosing instead to focus on the work that mattered most, ensuring that the victims of Operation Safekeep and Operation Mindbridge received the justice they had been denied for so long. The document he was most proud of wasn't any of the evidence that had brought down the Foundation, but rather a simple charter he had signed that morning. The establishment of the Reuben Carter Educational Foundation, funded by recovered Foundation assets that had been forfeited to the government and redirected to educational purposes. "The mission of the Foundation," the charter read, "shall be to educate young people about the importance of moral courage, the dangers of unchecked power, and the ongoing responsibility each generation bears to confront injustice wherever it exists." Micah, now 13, and somehow both more mature and more hopeful than when their journey had begun, had been instrumental in designing the Foundation's educational programs. His idea of connecting schools around the world through digital exchanges about historical justice had already been implemented in 43 countries. "I want kids my age to know that they don't have to wait until they're adults to make a difference," Micah explained to a group of visiting students. "Sometimes the most important discoveries come from being curious about things that don't seem right." The boy had been invited to speak at the United Nations, had testified before Congress about the importance of historical education, and had been featured on the covers of magazines around the world. But his favorite moments were still the quiet conversations with his father in William Carter's old apartment, which they had decided to keep as their permanent home. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't inherited this place?" Micah asked one evening, as they sat in the living room that had once been William's sanctuary. "Every day," Reuben replied. "We'd probably still be struggling to find our place in the world, instead of knowing that we're exactly where we're supposed to be." The transformation wasn't just personal, it was generational. The story of a father and son who had risked everything to expose the truth had inspired Similar courage in people around the world. Whistleblowers had come forward with evidence of other government cover-ups. Families had begun researching their own histories, uncovering truths that powerful interests had tried to bury. Dr. Rebecca Weiss Goldman had perhaps captured the broader significance best in her remarks at the center's dedication ceremony. What happened at Millbrook proves that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, cannot survive the persistent pressure of moral courage. The truth has a weight all its own, and eventually it breaks through. As the sun set on another day at the National Center for Historical Justice, Reuben and Micah walked together through the memorial garden, reading the names of victims who had finally received recognition after decades of being forgotten. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. There were still foundation assets to be recovered, still families seeking their stolen heritage, still young people who needed to learn the lessons that history offered. But the foundation had been laid, both literally and figuratively. The truth had found its voice, and that voice would continue speaking as long as there were people willing to listen and act. In the distance, the old prison bell tower stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, no longer a symbol of secrets buried in darkness, but a beacon reminding future generations that justice, however long delayed, never loses its power to transform the world. The garden they had tended with truth and courage would bloom for generations to come, ensuring that the victims' stories would never again be forgotten and that the price of justice would never again seem too high to pay.